Hello, I'm Tamara Copeland, President of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, an organization that we affectionately call WRAG. We support the philanthropic sector in Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and in the District of Columbia. In 2016, we embarked upon a learning journey to explore the depth and breadth and impact of structural racism and implicit bias. We called it Putting Racism on the Table. 2 years later, we asked our members if this learning journey had made a difference. We were pleased when they reported that 36% are now doing their grant making using a racial equity lens, and an additional 34% is considering that strategy. And while we know that philanthropy can definitely be catalytic, we also know that philanthropy alone will not make this a racially equitable region. So we have partnered with Leadership Greater Washington to expand the table for racial equity. We are joining with nonprofit leaders and with business leaders to again look at issues around structural racism and implicit bias. We are delighted that you are a part of this learning journey. Next, Dr. Patricia Devine and Dr. Will Cox will discuss implicit bias and how to break the prejudice habit.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here today to share what we've been doing with you. So I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin. I've been there for 32 years, and during that time I've been working on issues related to stereotyping, prejudice, and intergroup relations. And today what I want to do, along with Will, is to share with you some of the work that we've been doing that focuses on empowering people to break the prejudice habit. You're going to find that the habit metaphor is central to a lot of what I do. It'll help us to unpack this notion of unintentional bias that may make us unwittingly, unintentionally complicit in the perpetuation of bias, of stereotyping, of discrimination. And the goal is to try to facilitate creating inclusion on the pathway to overcoming bias, or overcoming bias on the pathway to creating inclusion might be a better way to say that. One of the things you're going to find, a lot of what we're doing is focusing on addressing bias at the individual level, asking the question, what can individuals do in terms of their own minds and the context in which they find themselves to try to reduce bias. But let me just offer a few opening reflections. One of the things you've probably discovered as you've been working on these issues and thinking about them in the work that you're doing is that bias is often a difficult topic to discuss. And part of the reason it's difficult is that as soon as issues come up, somebody raises a concern about bias or talks about stereotyping, the finger comes up. They're afraid the finger's going to come up. You're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a homophobe, you're ageist. We could go through lots of different biases, but people become concerned that they're being accused of something very often when they didn't intend to be insensitive or to show bias at all. One of the things that I want to suggest, although it's a difficult topic and sometimes people can feel accused, that is not what this is about, all right? Instead, what we hope not to do, we don't want to blame any one person or any one group for these things, but rather get involved in a discussion that would help us to understand the origins of bias, the consequences of bias, and what people might do to address these kinds of issues. And the reality is you're going to discover that these kinds of biases of the unintentional variety are rather ordinary and they're pervasive, all right? Now, the goal of the workshop then is to try to empower people to understand the nature of bias, where it comes from, how it manifests, and so forth, to be willing within themselves to confront bias, and there may be some opportunities of confronting bias in the world around them, but being willing to confront bias in oneself, and then learn some strategies, some tools to try to manage biases. And so that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And really the important issue here is to think about these issues with regard to climate and inclusion. One of the problems within many organizations is that we invite people to come and work with us. At the university, we invite students to study with us and faculty to work on their research and staff to work with us. And to the extent that biases pervade the experience, then we're hindering people's progress. And what we would like to do is to try to create opportunities for people to thrive within their positions. And to the extent that there are biases that constrain the opportunities for others or otherwise diminish their experience, it actually is inconsistent with institutional goals to try to create opportunities for people to make important contributions within organizations and to thrive. So you'll see that throughout the presentation, the goal is to try to work together as a community. You have set this as an agenda for yourselves. What we'd like to do is try to offer some language for thinking about these things and some tools that would help people to address the challenges of unintentional bias and then to create the opportunities for the members of the organization to thrive, to achieve their goals, and so forth. All right, so what's the roadmap for the workshop goals? The first is to help people understand implicit bias as a habit of mind. As was suggested, I actually prefer the term unintentional bias. Because a lot of times implicit bias by itself, people don't have a clear sense of what that means. But if we think about people intending to be fair and then these unintended biases getting in the way, the conflict is very well understood. And I think it sets the stage for people to really think about this notion. I suggested there's this habit of mind metaphor that is central to my work. It's been central since the very beginning, and it has followed through my work over the last 30 years. So here you can understand that unintended thoughts, and we'll talk about what those mean, can contradict people's personal values and their beliefs. The second thing that we'll try to do is to help people identify and label common forms of bias. See how bias is manifested in people's thought patterns and how it's perpetuated over time in people's minds and in the culture. The basic idea is to create what we refer to as bias literacy. So people have a new language, if you will, to talk about issues of bias. And Will's going to take us through these types of common manifestations of bias and unpack those things. And it's central, actually, understanding those principles to being able to confront the bias and try to reduce it. The next part of the presentation will focus on strategies that people could take from this workshop, incorporate into their mental life and into their everyday experiences that would help them to be less vulnerable to thinking about others through the lenses of stereotypes, okay? Will help them to break the prejudice habit and instead respond more consistently with their overarching goals. The final portion of the workshop will talk about some of the evidence that we've collected over the last 10 or so years that reflect the validity of this type of approach. So I want to take you back to the early 1980s when I got involved in this research and try to give you a feel for how I stumbled upon, if you will, some of these issues and made them the focus of my research. In the early 1980s, when I was a graduate student at The Ohio State University, I became puzzled by and interested in and concerned with a couple of different paradoxes. The first was the national paradox, or what I'll characterize as the national paradox. And this will be familiar to you, that we have ongoing disparities in a nation found on the principle of human equality. To the extent that we are truly committed to principles of human equality, we should be making better progress than we have. And in the 1980s, I thought that was true. And sadly, today, it's still true. Women are not paid equally for equal work. A lot of black people don't have equal opportunity to secure loans or in hiring situations. We'll learn a little bit about that later. And we could go through lots of examples. We are not yet achieving the ideals upon which the nation was founded. But as I thought about these issues, and as a social psychologist thinking about people and how they think, I got really interested in the paradox as it played out at the individual level and started to think about whether we could think about this individual level of analysis to gain some leverage on efforts to try to mitigate bias. So I refer to this as the personal paradox, and here's what the logic of the personal paradox basically suggests. That bias, this kind of unintended form of bias, these stereotypes that pop to mind and influence our thinking about others and judgments, that persists even among those who renounce prejudice. There's a tremendous amount of survey data that suggests that the majority of Americans reject notions that black people are inferior to white people or they're not as smart as white people, and they believe that women should earn equal pay to men. And yet we find, despite the fact people seem to be committed to these issues, they think about others through the lenses of stereotypes. All right. Now, I want you to just reflect on your own experience. Have you ever sort of formed a snap judgment about someone based on appearance, right? You come to a conclusion, and then sometimes you're like going, whoa, wait a minute, where did that come from? Well, where that came from is your early socialization experiences. I mean, one of the things that we find is that children are exposed to stereotypes early and often in development. All right, they're frequently, they're pervasive. If you just think about our culture and the embeddedness of stereotypes and biases in the culture, it turns out it's actually difficult to grow up in this culture without knowing the major stereotypes that are associated with prominent social groups. And in fact, children as early as 3, 4, 5, 6 can tell you what the stereotypes of groups are. Do they really know what it means? No. But they've got those associations. They've absorbed them from culture. They've absorbed them from the messages, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, from what their parents tell them, from what their teachers say and do in the classroom, what their peers say and do in the classroom. And the consequence is that these stereotypes are very well learned and firmly entrenched in people's cognitive systems long before they ever make decisions about whether they should think that way or want to think that way. In fact, children don't even start questioning these notions until they're in pretty much double digits at least, 10, 11, 12. Right? So you've already had 10 plus years of this socialization experience where these stereotypes are firmly entrenched. And I argue they are so firmly entrenched in people's mind that they get automatically activated. They are the default response. That's what spontaneously occurs to people when they interact with people from members of different groups. These are the habits of mind that turn out to get in the way of us responding in ways that are fair and without bias. So habits of mind that are automatically activated, and once they are activated, they pop to mind. Very often they influence our judgments of others without our awareness. We don't even notice. It happens so often, so frequently, and easily that without intention and often without awareness, we see these biases persist. This is what people mean, or this is what I mean by unintentional bias. Many people use the term implicit bias, all right? One of the things I want to suggest to you is that if you've had these kinds of experiences where those thoughts pop to mind, that in fact, you're rather ordinary. I'm sure you're extraordinary in other ways, all right? But in that regard, you, like all of those around you, are experiencing byproducts of your socialization experiences, growing up in a culture where those are the pervasive messages, easily supplied, reinforced day in and day out. And so these kinds of biases are rather ordinary, and they are pervasive. They occur in men and women, Black people, white people, Asian people, all kinds of people, young, old. We're going to find that these are ordinary, pervasive byproducts of people's socialization experiences. These habits of mind turn out to be a useful way to think about these issues, and it leads us to the very next question. If unintentional bias is a habit of mind, can individuals do anything to break the habit? And of course, here the news is good. All right, so I'll give you the answer, yes. All right, but we're going to take a couple of minutes to unpack what the habit metaphor is and then go through some other issues before you could see how. And just to ask you to think about this, have any of you tried to break any habit before? Okay, so yeah, everyone's shyly kind of raising their hands. I know I have. This is one of the ones that I tried to break, biting my nails. And I want you to think about what's involved in trying to break a habit. I mean, one of the things that you have to do is you have to decide, I don't want to do that anymore. It's very important that it's a personal decision. You have to accept the goal on your own. Now, I can tell you, when I was in high school and younger, my mother would say to me time and again, Patricia, do not bite your nails. It's unhealthy, it's bad for your teeth, right? She had great reasons. I mean, they should have been persuasive, but I wasn't persuaded. I had to come to that conclusion. And so it goes with issues of trying to address issues of stereotyping or unintentional bias, all right? But being motivated is but the first step, right? Is that sufficient for breaking a habit? What else do you have to do to try to break a habit? What do you think? I'm sorry? Practice. So hold that one, because that's step number 4. You always were ahead of the game, weren't you? Okay. But before you can practice, what's required? Yeah. Have a plan, yes. So that actually the motivation is part of the plan, so hold that thought. All right, what else? You have to be aware, right? You have to tune into when it is you do the habitual response, because if you don't know when it occurs and what it looks like, then you don't know what you need to disrupt, all right? Now, for breaking my nail biting habit, I became a detective of sorts. I said, when do my fingers approach my face, where I start to bite my nails? And so I studied my own experience, and I figured it out. It was typically when I sat down at the typewriter to write. And I had my fingers poised above the typewriter. It was the 80s, right? So fingers poised above the typewriter, and I'm trying to think about what it is I want to say. And as I was thinking, you know, I just found my fingers approach my face, and one by one, the nails disappeared. So that turns out to be useful, powerful information. It tells me when it is I'm vulnerable to the habitual response. And that's useful to try and figure out when I have to interrupt things. Even if you said you don't want to do it, sometimes you need to have some strategies for not doing it. You need some tools. You need something else to do, right? So what I did is I just placed my fingers on the keys of the typewriter as a tactile reminder of what I was supposed to be doing. If my fingers strayed, I put them back, right? Until the words started flowing. And then we need effort. Right? Because if any of you have tried to break a habit, motivation, being aware, having some strategies is not going to get it done, because you need to actually break the habit. You need to work at it. You need to put some effort into it. So let me just formalize this so that we have all of these, the necessary conditions to break a habit. First one was motivation. I really want to unpack what motivation does for us, though, because it turns out to be pretty important to understand the different components. Motivation certainly sets the goal, right? You didn't want the kids to see people, see you biting your nails. It generates the intentions to behave consistently with the goal. We're going to be talking about reducing bias, so here the context focuses on that. The other thing that motivation does for us is it leads to the establishment of standards that are used, that tell you what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Fingers in my mouth, unacceptable. Fingers typing, acceptable, all right? So the standards are what is acceptable and unacceptable, and then we use those standards to monitor our progress. So we have to see, are we approaching the goal, are we receding from the goal, and so forth. So we evaluate progress to the goal. Now, it can also heighten the affective consequences of approaching the goal, that you can feel a sense of satisfaction and pride in the accomplishment. Then we'll go to awareness, the second component. All right, and really there are 2 components of awareness that I want to highlight. The first we've really already talked about as we reflected on the sort of spontaneous activation of these biases that can influence judgments that we make of others. That's the personal vulnerability to the habit. And the second component, and this is really important in the context of we're talking about today, is really awareness of how bias manifests, what it looks like, and how it is perpetuated over time, as I said, in people's minds and in the culture. And it is this component of awareness that Will is going to be unpacking for us in just a moment or two. Turns out it's powerful information, it's necessary information, because that's what gives us the leverage to know when to interrupt the habitual response. We need strategies to address the habit, and I'm going to share with you a toolkit of 7 strategies later that would help people mitigate the tendency to think in stereotypic ways, to prevent the vulnerability to falling into habitual responses. And then there's effort over time to break the habit, all right? So with that as background, I'm going to turn things over to Will, and he'll talk us through the manifestations and perpetuations of stereotypes and biases.
What are the mechanisms, both within our culture and within our brains, that lead to the perpetuation of bias in opposition to evidence that say the biases aren't good, in opposition to people's values, as Trish has been talking about, and people's intentions? And so that's a bit of what I'm going to talk to you about in this section. Manifestations of bias and why it's perpetuated. So with Trisha's nail biting example, at the end of the day, it's very easy to tell whether you've made progress towards your goal of not biting your nails anymore. You can just look at your nails, say, all right, Did I bite them today? Did I not? Do I have nails or do I not? Very simple, very easy to tell if you've made progress towards breaking that habit. Bias is not as simple as that. Bias manifests in many different ways, many subtle ways that we're not always attuned to. And there's not just one way. You can't just sit at the end of the day, did I have any bias at all today? Any bias in my perceptions, in my behavior, in my judgments of people? It's not something that we can do very easily because it can be so subtle. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to walk through a few different manifestations, a few of the common forms that bias takes in the interest of building what Trish called earlier bias literacy. So I'm going to kind of give you a term of a specific way bias manifests, talk about some examples, some of the research behind that bias term. And then I'm going to spend a little time on the specific perpetuation mechanisms that lead to bias being reinforced and perpetuated in our minds, with the goal of kind of being able to stop it and be able to say, hey, this is something that could perpetuate bias in my mind in order to short circuit it and reduce cognitive bias overall. So to get us started, stereotypes, the basic thing stereotypes do is they guide our expectations for other people. They lead us to expect that someone from a particular social group is going to have certain ability levels, display certain kinds of behaviors, and so on. So as an example of this, so we're here visiting you from Wisconsin. What are some expectations that people might have about us from Wisconsin? Go ahead and shout them out. Cheese. What else? We're really nice. Well, we are. What else? Wisconsin, come on. Love to party. All right. So usually we get the last two, Green Bay Packers and beer. So just by the fact that we're coming here from Wisconsin, people very often have these expectations. We like cheese, like beer, love the Green Bay Packers. Trish definitely loves the Green Bay Packers. And so, the stereotype, the idea about Wisconsin and people from Wisconsin leads to these expectations you have before you even meet us, before you even talk to us. Now, Trish and I are probably never systematically disadvantaged by the fact that people expect that we like cheese. I mean, if we get a cheese gift basket, we're probably really happy about that. But think about when the expectations are created by race or gender or other group statuses that are historically marginalized. The expectation is that students of color aren't going to perform as well in schools. How do those expectations negatively affect the experience of those students? The first of these constructs I'm going to go through, something called prescriptive norms. So talking about how stereotypes set up expectations, how we expect people are going to behave. They also set up how we think people should behave, and this is the prescriptive part of this thing, prescriptive norms. We think that people should behave the way the stereotypes tell us, at least as kind of an automatic response. So the first of these bias constructs. I'm going to talk about one way that stereotypes setting up expectations can lead to different evaluations, especially I'm going to be talking about in a hiring context. And that's called Reconstructing Credentials. So another way the stereotypes affect us is when we're evaluating someone, let's say I'm going to be talking about an example with a police chief position. So police chief, very masculine, male stereotype sort of role. If you have a male applicant for that, it's a male type role, male applicant, it just kind of fits together. There's just kind of this gut feeling, the stereotype tells you, oh, these things go together, this is the right way to go about things. And what happens is people evaluating job applicants or students or what have you, that initial kind of good fit comes first, and then they look for evidence to justify that gut feeling that they have. And this is the reconstructing credentials idea. So after you have that good fit, people kind of change how they're weighing different kinds of credentials. One of the reasons this is especially troubling is that in the end, it seems like things are based on objective evidence. You're pointing to credentials, you have a list of, no, this is exactly what we want for this position. And so it justifies discrimination, even though it seems objective, even though it's justifying discrimination. And Trish is going to talk in the next, or in one of the next sections about how we can short circuit some of that. So the third bias perpetuation and manifestation mechanism I'm going to share is called self-fulfilling prophecy. It's pretty much what it sounds like. Essentially what this is when you have expectations for someone, often it leads you to behave in ways that get them to live up to your expectations or down to your expectations, as the case may be. And I'm going to share one of the classic studies demonstrating this in a classroom context. So Rosenthal and Jacobson, they were working with actual teachers in first and second grade. And what happened in the study, at the beginning of the year, all the students took an IQ sort of test. The researchers took it and scored the IQ test and then came back to the teachers and said, a few of the students in your class, based on their profile, based on our research and our understanding of developmental psychology, they're really going to blossom over the next year. They're set to become what they call bloomers. They're really going to grow a lot, become your talented and gifted students, and so on over this school year. Unbeknownst to the teachers, however, those students were just picked at random. There was no actual relation to their test scores or anything like that. And what the researchers were trying to do is evaluate, well, if we just plant an expectation in the teacher's mind, is it going to lead them to behave in different ways that leads the students to perform differently? And so they followed the teachers and students over the year, took a lot of different measures that I'll talk about. And at the end of the year, one of the main outcomes they looked at is IQ gains. And that's what this graph shows. So you can see in the blue bar, that's the IQ gains for the students that were just randomly labeled to be a bloomer in the teacher's mind, not saying anything to the student, not saying anything to students' parents, just the teacher thought that they would bloom. At the end of the year, they had much higher IQ gains than the students that didn't get randomly selected for that label. So how does this happen? Well, over the course of the year, they collected many different things. They looked at homework assignments, all sorts of stuff. And there were actually a lot of things that the teachers did, a lot of ways they behaved differently towards the students that they thought were bloomers than the ones that they thought were not bloomers. So they smiled more at students who they expected to be blossoming. They wrote more comments on the homework. They actually the researchers counted the number of words written on homework assignments. They gave more feedback to help the student grow more. So as you can imagine, the teachers at the end of the study, when they found out, got fully debriefed on what the study was and, their behavioral difference, of course, they were mortified because they're not going into the teaching profession trying to hold back certain students and push forward other students. They want all their students to succeed. And it just kind of goes to show how subtle and unintentional these things can be. Now, in this case, the researchers just randomly, planted the expectations about certain students. But think about how these expectations can affect things when they're driven by race, when they're driven by gender, and so on. Expectations that black students aren't going to perform well, or are lazy, or what have you. And so these things can play out in very consequential ways that then, 1 year of school, if the student's not doing as well, then they're starting the next year of school a little bit behind. And these things can perpetuate themselves in very pernicious ways. So that's self-fulfilling prophecy. The last set of things I'm going to talk to you about are ways that bias gets perpetuated in our own minds. And as humans, we like to think that we're very objective, rational beings, but the fact of the matter is that in the end, we actually aren't in many ways. Much of the ways that we process evidence is irrational. And I'm going to share a bit of that with you now. The first construct here I'm going to talk about is something called attentional spotlights. So one thing that our brains do is draws our attention to things that confirm our expectations, to confirming evidence, and draws our attention kind of away from stuff that disconfirms our expectations. And the study I'm going to share that demonstrates this is also in a school context by some researchers named Darley and Gross. What happened in this study, it was the participants were student teachers. And they learned about this young girl named Hannah. They learned that Hannah's going into the 4th grade, and then they watched a little video about Hannah's background. And so they were basically manipulated to be in either to think Hannah is high in socioeconomic status or low in socioeconomic status. And the stereotype or expectation we're dealing with here is the idea that higher socioeconomic status students are going to perform better and be smarter and so on, and lower socioeconomic status students are not. So the teachers watched this video of Hannah and her background. So they saw that she had a really nice house and saw her playground, which was all brand new equipment. It had a basketball hoop with a net on it, so it's in the classy area. They learned about her parents. They had slightly higher paying jobs and so on. Or if they were learning that Hannah was low in SES, she had a more dilapidated house. Her parents had lower paying jobs, more rusty playground equipment, and then it was just a plain black top basketball court that didn't have a net on it, so it's not a good area. Or so the reasoning went. And so they just learn about her background. They learn she's going into the 4th grade. What the student teachers are asked to do is estimate her grade level ability in year in school and months. So this set of teachers, they saw her background. They learned she's going into 4th grade. That's all the information they had. They're like, OK, she's going into 4th grade. I think she's probably about 4th grade level. They have nothing else to go on. So in this case, just having that group status didn't lead them to change their estimate of her grade level ability. But there was another condition where, in addition to getting her background, they saw Hannah take a test. So they learn she's high or low socioeconomic status, and then they watch her take a test. And the way this test works, it's another video. All they see is the back of Hannah's head as she's talking to a teacher who's kind of giving her the questions, and she's responding to the teacher. And her performance is decidedly mixed. So there's some really difficult questions that she gets right, some really difficult questions that she gets wrong, some really easy questions that she gets right, and some easy questions that she gets wrong. Everyone saw the same video of her performance if they were in the condition where they saw the test performance. Then they were asked, estimate her grade level ability in years in school and months. If they thought that Hannah was low in SES, they were like, oh, she's about 3rd grade, 8 months going into the 4th grade. If it was high SES Hannah, they thought she was high SES, saw the exact same test performance, she's about 5th grade level going into the 4th grade. So what's going on here? Well, this is the attentional spotlight idea. So when they followed up with the teachers who thought she was high SES, they remembered all those difficult questions she got right, which is like, wow, she's getting those difficult questions right. They don't remember the difficult ones she got wrong, and they're not remembering the really easy ones that she got wrong that should be pulling down their estimate of her performance, because she should be able to get those easy ones that she got wrong. The people in the low SES, they forget all those difficult ones she got right, and they're remembering the easy ones she got wrong. So this is the spotlight. The expectations are drawing your attention like a spotlight to the confirming evidence. They're remembering the things that fit with this idea of Hannah being high SES and therefore probably higher performing, and leads to very different outcomes, 5th grade versus 3rd grade, 8 months. And then if you kind of go through this and you then have this estimate of the student, well then, if you're about to teach them over the year, that's going to feed into that whole self-fulfilling prophecy sort of stuff that we talked about last. Bias didn't just appear when they had no evidence to process. It's this biased evidence processing where they're attending to certain things. The stereotypes are drawing their attention like a spotlight that leads to this bias, in this study at least. So another term for this kind of idea that we weigh confirming evidence more heavily than disconfirming evidence is confirmation bias. So during the video of her taking the test, there was one part where Hannah goes, and kind of taps on the desk. And they asked the teachers to interpret this ambiguous behavior. If it was high SES Hannah, what do you think the teachers interpreted this kind of behavior? She's thinking. She's contemplative. She wants to make sure that she's going to get it right. What about if it was low SES Hannah? Stalling. She's stalling. She doesn't know the answer. You know, completely different interpretations for the exact same behavior. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Trish. So another way the expectations lead to interpretive bias. So last set of things we're going to talk about, first, confirmation bias. So this is where we weigh evidence that confirms our expectations more heavily than evidence that disconfirms. And I often get into conversations with people about this when they come to me. I'm a stereotyping researcher, and they say, well, in my experience, stereotypes are usually true. And I say, well, actually, if you look at systematic evidence, that's not necessarily the case. And one of the reasons that it seems to you like stereotypes are true or accurate is that you weigh evidence differently when it supports stereotypes than when it doesn't support stereotypes. I'm going to share one study that Trish and I did, actually, that demonstrates this. So what you need to know about this task, people are going through and they're making judgments about a number of different target people that we present to them. And the judgments could be influenced by stereotypes. And what we're doing is after each judgment, we're giving people feedback about whether the stereotype was right, like actually led to the correct conclusion, or if the stereotype was inaccurate in that moment and using the stereotype led you to the incorrect conclusion. So this way we can kind of manipulate what out in the world, in our laboratory context anyway, how accurate stereotypes might actually be, and look how people respond to those different patterns of evidence. So in one of the conditions, which I'm calling the confirming condition, most of the people that participants encountered in this study actually confirmed stereotypes. So 75% of the time, stereotypes led to the correct conclusion, and only about 25% of the time did it lead to the incorrect conclusion. Then in another condition, we just reverse that. So most of the times, for people in the disconfirming condition, the stereotypes led to the wrong conclusion, and just a few times, every once in a while, the stereotype would actually lead you to the correct conclusion about them. And then what we're looking at is over time, how does that affect their rate of stereotyping? Are they stereotyping more or less, learning from this evidence over time? How are they weighing the evidence? So when people in the confirming condition, as they're learning, stereotypes are usually leading to correct conclusions. Confirmatory evidence is more common. They stereotype more over time, which is what you expect. They're getting evidence that stereotypes are right, so they should stereotype more in that condition. When people got mostly disconfirming evidence, however, it's just a flat line. So they don't go down. Even though 75% of the trials are disconfirming, telling you stereotypes are leading to the wrong conclusion, it doesn't change their rate of stereotyping. They're just flatlining. And if you kind of translate this a little numerically, this means that for every, because there's 75% of people are disconfirming stereotypes here and it's not changing, that means that for every one person who confirms a stereotype, it takes 3 people who disconfirm the stereotype just to kind of balance it out in how you're weighing things in your mind. Not even to change it, just to keep it at the same level. And this is confirmation bias. So it's this weighing of evidence differently. When someone disconfirms a stereotype, your brain doesn't want to kind of upend its system and change your initial expectations that have been socialized over your whole life. So in these 2 conditions, we're talking about people actually having the evidence, like have a stereotypic assumption about someone, and then I learn that it was correct or incorrect. But when we're going out in the world, that's not what really happens all the time. Like, you'll be walking down the street, stereotype will pop to mind about someone, you make some assumption about someone. You don't run up to them and say, I had a stereotypic thought about you. Like, am I right? Like that doesn't happen. You just go about your day. And I was very interested in that sort of phenomenon. How does your brain treat that kind of lack of evidence? So when there's no evidence, it's just an untested assumption. This is the last of those constructs that I'm going to go through, untested assumptions. So in the same study, we had a third condition where people just got no feedback. Same task as everyone else, except they're not learning whether their stereotypic assumptions were correct or incorrect. And what we see in that condition is people go up, and it wasn't statistically different from the confirming condition. Basically, your brain treats this assumption as if it's valid evidence. It's that assumption I had, that person actually met that assumption. Your brain generates the idea and stores it as if it's valid evidence. And so just encountering people, thoughts pop to mind, leads to the stereotypes being reinforced when there's no evidence for them at all. So these are confirmation bias and untested assumptions, and then the attentional spotlight. Those are 3 of the ways that our brains perpetuate bias within our own minds. But by recognizing them and looking out for them and kind of putting the label to them, you can work on kind of short-circuiting that process. Pay more attention when someone disconfirms evidence. If you find yourself having an untested assumption about someone, ask, how do I know? Do I really know anything, or was that just something that popped to mind? And question it, put the brakes on it. Don't treat it as though it were valid evidence.
How can we move forward to try to decrease the likelihood that we show stereotypic biases, see people through the lenses of stereotypes, make assumptions about them based on their social category membership? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can use these powerful frontal lobes to guide our efforts to reduce the likelihood that we will think about others in biased ways. And ultimately, what I'm going to do is to present to you, as I said at the outset, a toolkit, a set of 7 strategies that you could take from this workshop and you can incorporate into your own mental life and your professional and personal lives to decrease the likelihood that you think of others in stereotypic ways. But before I can do that, I really need to talk with you about some ineffective strategies. Strategies that actually don't work and leave you more vulnerable rather than less. More vulnerable to thinking about others in categorical or stereotypic ways. It turns out each of these strategies is tremendously intuitive, and when I talk about them, you would think they should work, right? And these are the ones that people tend to reach for when they want to not stereotype others or think about them in group-based ways. Each one in turn fails, and so I want to caution you against relying on these strategies. The first one is something called stereotype suppression. The idea is that what you want to do is banish stereotypes from your mind. All right, push them out of the way, put them under the rug, under the table, sweep them away. Whatever you do, don't think about stereotypes. And so far from banishing it from consciousness, to know if you've done that, you actually have to bring it to mind and think about it. The consequence is that once people are released from the obligation to suppress the unwanted thought, what you find is that those thoughts sort of surface with abandon, right? They come top of the mind. The cognitive psychologists say they become hyper accessible. And once they are so highly accessible, top of the mind, you're more likely to rely on them than if you had never tried to suppress in the first place. So although we can do this in the short term and we can try to suppress these things, this stereotype rebound notion that the stereotype pops to mind, it rebounds with abandon, top of the mind, leaves us more rather than less vulnerable to thinking of others in stereotypic ways, treating them in the context of stereotypic assumptions and so forth. A second strategy I want to caution you against, though it seems like it should work, and I'm sure you've heard about this kind of general approach, is color blindness. Let's call it group blindness. It could be age blindness, it could be gender blindness, it could be, you know, whatever the group might be. But in the context of talking about color blindness, the basic idea is attempting to ignore race when interacting with racial minorities. There are at least three problems with this approach. One, I already told you it doesn't work. I'm going to tell you how it doesn't work in just a moment. But the first problem is that it is not possible. That is, our sensory systems, right? I mean, our sensory systems immediately pick up cues to skin tone and other group diagnostic characteristics that activate regions of the brain that connect to stereotypes and so on. We're not aware of these processes. It unfolds quite unintentionally, all right? So one, it's not possible. We detect these kinds of variations in skin tone. We detect lines on the face for age. I mean, right, they're all white hair, even when I color it, it comes back, right? All of these kinds of things that are kind of cues to group membership. So one, it's not possible. The second thing is it's not desirable. That is, many people derive considerable esteem and positive identity from their group memberships. They value those memberships. They are important to them. And to say, I do not see you as a member of that group, I don't notice race, seems inauthentic. Okay, and can be demeaning of people's experience, right? So not possible, not desirable. Third thing is it tends to backfire, all right? So there's some research, very interesting research done by Victoria Plout and her colleagues, conducted in a healthcare organization in which she measured among white employees within these healthcare organizations the extent to which they endorse these colorblind notions, right? Colorblind ideology. Items like, it's important not to notice race, I try not to notice race when interacting with racial minorities, and so on and so forth. So there's several items that capture that. And you could be low or you could be high on that. What she's really interested in is what is the experience of black coworkers as a function of interacting with people who either embrace or don't embrace that kind of colorblind ideology. And what she finds across 117 healthcare organizations is that the more the white coworkers embrace colorblind ideology, the less good is the experience of the black coworkers. The less they feel like they belong to within the organization, and the less effectively they work within that organization, all right? So what's going wrong? Well, one of the things I want to highlight, and I want to be cautious here, I think for a lot of people when they say, I want to be colorblind, that's important, what they mean to say is that I don't want to treat people unfairly based on group membership. But I want you to think about, if you say, I'm going to be colorblind, and I want you to think about this for a second, how do you do that? And so what I would argue is that not possible, not desirable, and it doesn't work. So it's probably not a particularly good strategy. And as with stereotype suppression, I'm going to try to give you some alternative ways to approach these kinds of issues. The third strategy I have to highlight before we move on to the toolkit of effective strategies is having too strong a belief in your own personal objectivity. I mean, this one should work, right? What is better than being biased? Be objective, right? The idea here, however, is that the more people reflect on their personal objectivity, what the research evidence is suggesting is it leaves them more rather than less vulnerable to showing the bias that their objective selves say they shouldn't. So I would argue that rather than having too strong a belief in our personal objectivity, we might be better served by accepting the humbling possibility that we could be biased, and then learning some strategies that would help us to avoid bias, to use the power of those frontal lobes, our executive function, to try to regulate bias, put the brakes on it, and respond consistently with values. So in this context, what I'd like to do is share with you a toolkit of strategies. There are 7 in all, that, as I said previously, you can take from this workshop, incorporate into your mental life, your personal and your professional life, and to the extent that you learn them and start to practice them, they could help to reduce the likelihood that you would fall vulnerable to falling into the habit of the habit of mind in terms of thinking of people in stereotypic ways and so forth. Now, I'm going to present each strategy one at a time because it's just easiest to present them one at a time. What I want you to recognize, however, it is truly a toolkit. The tools have synergistic effects. They have overlapping implications, and use of one strategy can facilitate and enhance the use of another strategy, right? So that's very important to recognize. Second thing I want to tell you is, and this is really good news, none of them are hard to do. All right, so let's talk about the first strategy. It's something called stereotype replacement. And to try to help you understand how to implement this strategy, we have a mnemonic that would give you an idea about how this particular strategy would unfold. So if you can remember the mnemonic detect, reflect, and reject, you'll be well on your way to understanding how to implement the stereotype replacement strategy. In contrast to stereotype suppression, which says push stereotypes out of the way, stereotype replacement says, no, we need to recognize, we need to put it front and center, we need to work on this issue, recognize the bias, and then work to mitigate it. So what's involved? The first step is detecting when it is that stereotypes pop to mind. When is it that we see the influence of stereotypes and biases in our own minds and in other people's minds, perhaps, in what they say and do, in media, that we could detect the influence of stereotypes in the media, recognizing their powerful impact in perpetuating bias over time. So we want to detect, tune into, become aware of when it is we're vulnerable to thinking in stereotypic ways and detect the influence of these biases. It becomes important to think it through. Detecting it isn't sufficient. If we understand why, in the ways that Will was talking about, all those perpetuation mechanisms that could lead to help us understand why the bias persists, that will be helpful in terms of addressing the issue. So reflect on the source of the stereotype, whether it's one of these bias constructs, whether it's social roles as they historically, for my student Sarah, thinking about the doctor-nurse example, reject the stereotypic portrayal or thought. If we're talking about the media, you could recognize why screenwriters create stereotypic characters. Well, then they don't have to do as much work because they know your minds will fill in the gaps, right? But then we have to really reject the idea of saying, well, they may have portrayed a woman in a weak, highly emotional way, but surely not all women are like that, right? And you know women who are not like that. Or if they portrayed an Asian person as shy and retiring, well, we know Asian people are not all shy and retiring, and you have to really recognize that, reject that notion, and then replace it one. The final step is the replacement of that stereotypical thought with one that is less biased, perhaps more reflective of people's values. So you could think about all kinds of ways and contexts in which you could deploy this type of strategy. It's not hard, but it requires a little bit of effort. Right? And once you start to work on it, you'll start to notice these things more and perhaps become more efficient in the identification, the detection, reflection, rejection, and replacement process. Second strategy is we call modifying your environment. You could think within your organizations, you have websites and other things where you kind of give an idea of who it is that populates your organization. And I think it becomes important to evaluate the images that pervade our environments to try to evaluate the extent to which people who are different social category memberships can feel like they belong and that there's a good fit in the environment. So you can look at your website, you can look at images of people perhaps that you've celebrated over the years and their contributions. Evaluate what messages there are about who belongs and who can succeed. Then the question is what to do about it. So what we're trying to do is to broaden the set of images to increase the representation of underrepresented groups. And we're trying to be attentive to our website and any other type of public display about who we are and who is welcome within the organization. All right. So again, especially with the iPhones and other devices, quite easy to start to address. But you need to be mindful of the need to do it, put some effort into it. You want them to look as good as the other images and so forth. Make sense? All right. So again, not hard to do, but requires a little bit of effort. Third strategy is seeking individuating information. I mentioned a moment ago, and I think Will talked about this earlier, that stereotypes actually serve to fill in gaps. If there's something we don't know about someone, that a lot of times we can rely on stereotypes to fill in the gap. If we don't know what a person's interests are, we might use stereotypic assumptions that I might not be interested in math, and I might be interested in some other type of activity. Well, being mindful of that turns out to be important so that we could recognize the vulnerability to seeing others through stereotypic lenses suggests that we might want to put some effort into collecting individuating information about people. Focus on details that make someone a unique person. This turns out to be really important in job application situations where a lot of times things start to get sorted. You know, this one's viable, this one not, this one good, this one not. And very often we're guided by stereotypic assumptions, and particularly if there's an area where the assumption is not addressed in the materials that are provided. Recognizing that would give us an opportunity to collect some additional information, do a little bit more homework to make sure that we have a full profile, a full complement of information upon which to make a decision. Make sense? Now, one thing that's nice about this strategy is it can be deployed proactively in advance of making decisions, recognizing the vulnerability to thinking of others in stereotypic ways that is pervasive and rather ordinary, but we can counteract it. Or we could do it retroactively. So if we've made a decision and recognize that we may have fallen vulnerable to this, to work on it into the future. We want to make sure we have a full complement of information rather than relying on stereotypic assumptions that could leave us vulnerable. While we were talking about that, I said, you know, this could work in lots of different ways, right? So when I was in high school, I was a basketball player. I also am rather short of stature. Turns out being short of stature isn't necessarily a bad thing, except for rebounding, right? Short of stature people dribble down here. It's harder to steal the ball if you're a tall person, if someone's dribbling down here. And when you're short of stature, you learn to shoot from outside, right? So I had a deadly three-point shot before there was a three-point line, right? And so, you know, that left the other people vulnerable. So you can imagine the way in which you could lose out in lots of different contexts, some more consequential than others. Make sense? All right, fourth strategy, perspective taking. This will make sense to you. You've probably done it over time. The logic here is to try to imagine what it would feel like from a first-person perspective. What would it feel like to be in another person's situation? Now, fully recognizing you can't really know what a person's experience is, but the idea is you at least try to imagine what it would feel like, for example, to have your abilities in STEM context called into question, not because of any problem you tried to solve or any work product that you generated, but because of your gender. Being assumed not being capable, or that you cannot be a good leader, not because of your efforts, but because of your gender. To have your motivation and abilities called into question in the classroom, not because of anything you've done, but because of the color of your skin. To imagine what it would be like to be thought of as a terrorist in the TSA line, not because of any suspicious behavior you were doing in the TSA line, but because you had a hijab on or were assumed to be Muslim. What does that feel like? And what about that when it happens time and again over people's experience? It turns out three things tend to happen if people just spend a few moments reflecting on this. One, they say, you know, that's not really fair. And we love fairness. So that's actually good because we love fairness. They say it's not fair, and because they're trying to imagine what it would be like, they say, I wouldn't want that to happen to me. And the combination of those two things leads people to start to experience some empathy for that person's experience. They start to care a little bit more than they had previously about how people are treated and the ways in which those assumptions that people make may be experienced in negative ways. All right, so this was a sort of transformative experience. I think when people spend a little bit of time thinking about things, it alters the way their perspective and how they're viewing these issues, and it makes them less vulnerable to falling into the habit of thinking of others through the assumptions guided by stereotypes. All right, so deployed proactively or retroactively. Fifth strategy, it says consider situational explanations. I have to give you a little bit of social psychology to understand how this one unfolds. One of the things that turns out to be true of human beings is that they're tremendously curious about why other humans do the things they do. And social psychologists, in trying to identify explanations or causes for behavior, have generated two major categories of explanation. One category of explanation reflects internal personal characteristics of the person. We call those dispositional explanations, looking inside the person, his or her ability levels, for example, to explain performance. The other category of explanation focuses on aspects of the situation, the surrounding circumstances that may have contributed to and caused the behavior. Dick Nisbet and Lee Ross have identified a very strong bias that we show. They call it the fundamental attribution error, which suggests that when we're trying to explain other people's behavior, we jump to dispositional conclusions. We favor dispositional over situational explanations. Partly we're attending to people, we're looking at them as active agents, and we're not attending to circumstances as much. Tom Pettigrew took the logic a bit further, and he identified what's called the ultimate attribution error, which suggests that when we are explaining the behavior of minority individuals, or for example, women in contexts where they may their behavior could reflect stereotypic assumptions, we're even more likely to jump to those dispositional conclusions. It's an exaggerated tendency to jump to dispositional conclusions. So I want you to think about women in a STEM context. Let's take an exam context. There's a chemistry exam or some other STEM context exam, and the woman performs poorly, or we have an African American student in the classroom who performs poorly on an exam. Can you think of any other reason than academic prowess or mathematical prowess for the STEM why someone might perform poorly on an exam? Anything else? Yes? Bad sleep. Bad sleep. You didn't get a good night's sleep. I didn't get a good night. I hope I'm doing okay today. I didn't get a good night's sleep because I was obsessed with politics. But that could undermine your performance, right? Can you attend to the task at hand, which is reading exam items and working through the problems and giving answers? Anything else? Yes? Test anxiety, all right? That's sort of internal to the person, but it's not the dispositional quality that comes from assumptions about their ability, right? All right, anything else? Death in a family. Again, think about what do all of these things have in common. If you had a death in a family and you're emotionally wrought, then you don't have the cognitive energy and focus for the task at hand. When I was talking about this particular strategy, which is thinking about how a situation may have influenced someone's behavior more than, or at least in addition to, an individual characteristic, that it can serve as a protective factor, leaving people less vulnerable to jumping to stereotypic conclusions. I was talking about this with some educators from Oakton Community College, and this one, I'm going to do a second impression if you could bear with me. As I was I'll take my glasses off for this. As I was talking about this, her eyes opened wide, her jaw literally went down, and then she said, "Oh shit." And I was, in that moment I was like, uh-oh, what's going on? And I just said, is there anything you'd like to share? And what she said was that she recognized, as I was talking about this particular strategy, that she did not accord her minority and white students the same opportunity to explain themselves. And she went on to say, when the minority students were late to class or didn't finish a homework assignment, I made a dispositional assumption about they didn't care to get there on time, or they didn't have the ability to do the assignment, or weren't motivated. But when my white students didn't show up on time, I just said, hey, what's going on? How come you were late? Something happening? Right? Just this sort of natural tendency to give the benefit of the doubt, if you will, that situational forces may be at work for the white student that the minority students were not given. For her, it was transformative, right? Tuning into these things, recognizing them, actually serves as the cue, I need to do something, and here's the thing that you can do. At least entertain the possibility that situational circumstances could be at work. All right? Creates a kind of protective factor. Committing to credentials is strategy 6. So if you are thinking about job positions, staff positions, whatever it might be, to think about the credentials that should allow for success in that position. What does the position require? What are the characteristics we think would allow for success? Commit to those, and then evaluate the applications in light of the criteria, not leaving yourself vulnerable to that kind of slippery process, all right? Now, this can be done by individuals. You hold yourself accountable to those credentials, but if you're making a decision in a group context, there's often search committees that work on hiring, that the committee decides what the credentials are, and you hold each other accountable to them. Now, this isn't going to necessarily root out all of the problems, but it's going to set you up on the pathway to trying to ensure that you're giving all candidates the equal opportunity to show their credentials. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. All right, so the final strategy, and this will make sense to you, is increasing opportunities for contact, trying to create circumstances where you could have meaningful contact with people who are different from yourself. So seeking opportunities for greater interaction with members of other groups. In some cities, in some locations, that's easier than others in terms of the diversity of people who are present in organizations. For a lot of people, there are two main obstacles to having intergroup contact. One is they're uncertain. Right? They don't want to do it wrong necessarily, and they don't know what to say or do, and they feel anxious. And so the reality is there's a lot of anxiety that can surround intergroup contact, and I want to say yes, there is. And I'm going to say this ever so gently. Please understand, get over it. I'm not trying to be tongue-in-cheek, but if you put yourself out there and you create the opportunity for contact, that you might actually discover some individuating information about someone, and you might learn to take their perspective, and you might see these other types of tools that they could work in synergistic way. But there's another problem. Beyond the anxiety, there's a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. And let me just describe to you what this is, and then I think the term will make sense. My colleagues Jennifer Richardson and Nicole Shelton were interested in this phenomenon when at Princeton University they had made great strides to diversify their student body, and they had increased the minority representation at Princeton. They were achieving their goals, but what Nicole was noticing in different locations on campus, like the student eating places, I forget what they're called at Princeton, that the black students sat together and the white students sat together, and they were not having contact, right? So there was the opportunity for contact, but it wasn't being realized in those circumstances. And so they decided they would try to do some research about this and try to figure it out. And so they developed some questionnaire items, and they asked black students and white students the extent to which they wanted to have contact with people from the other group. Lo and behold, white students and black students want to have contact with people from the other group, or at least they reported high levels of interest. They had another question, though, and the question was, how much do you think, black students want to have contact with white students, and vice versa? And there, all the students got it wrong. White students assumed black students didn't want to have contact with white students, and black students assumed white students didn't want to have contact with black students. They were ignorant, if you will, of the intentions and interests of the others, but in a pluralistic way. Everybody got it wrong. So recognizing that, maybe that can help to address the anxiety, knowing, in fact, that people would like to have this kind of contact may ease that tension. At the University of Wisconsin, a lot of the students tell us that I'd like to know more about LGBTQ issues, but I actually don't know who all the LGBTQ people are, right? Sometimes people think they know. They don't actually, all right? They make assumptions, often cued by stereotypic things, but they could participate in something like activities sponsored by the Gay Straight Student Alliance, or they could join the Gay Straight Student Alliance that would give them those opportunities, and that it would be natural rather than just showing up at the black student and saying, hi, I'm here, be a friend of mine, right? Because you want it to be authentic as well. And so you could start to think about different kinds of contexts that might lend themselves more naturally to creating that type of contact. Events that occur around DC, right? I'm sure there are all kinds of opportunities where there are speakers who are addressing related issues and so on, and you might have an opportunity to have contact. And this is a special category these days. But I like to raise it because this is one of the areas in which there may be the strongest stereotypes operating these days. There are very strong assumptions made about Republicans by Democrats, and by Democrats by liberals and conservatives. And I don't want to be naive. I mean, they have differences in terms of beliefs about social policies and so on. But it often goes much further to questions about intelligence and so forth that are not borne out by evidence. And in fact, when people get beyond those general social category memberships and they get to know people who are actually liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, what they discover, and the evidence supports this, is that there's more similarities than there are differences, and that it becomes important to look beyond social category membership, recognizing we may be making assumptions about people that are not fully founded. Again, there are differences, but there are also some similarities. When circumstances don't present themselves naturally, what we encourage people to do is to seek out opportunities for greater exposure to people's backgrounds and experiences through the movies they watch, the books they read, the media they consume. I'm just going to give two quick examples. You could generate so many more, but I don't know how many of you read this book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. It's a book written by Coates as a letter to his teenage son about his concerns, his fears, his worries about what this young black man will face in a racially divided America, commenting on some of his experiences in the historical context of a racially divided America, the vulnerabilities and so forth. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is not an easy read. It may bring you to tears. It may make you frustrated. It may make you just agitated and angry at our society in some ways, but it opened your eyes to a set of issues and experiences if you're a white middle-aged person from Wisconsin, woman from Wisconsin, that I couldn't possibly have access to based on my own experience. And so for me, it was eye-opening, and it was important, and it contributed to my understanding of racial dynamics in our both historical and contemporary society. The same is true for Hidden Figures. Have you seen this movie? All right, if you haven't seen it, again, I highly recommend it for all the reasons moviegoers like to go to movies. It's entertaining, it's well acted, it's well directed, visually it's nice. I'm sure they got some awards for something, right? But what's really important about this is the story of these three young black women trying to make a contribution in a white male-dominated world of Nassau. The problem being worked on in the 60s at this time, when Katherine Johnson, played by Taraji P. Henson, as the sort of central character in here, was getting John Glenn out into space. They had figured that out. The question is, how do you get him back? How do you get him back safely through the heat shield, right, without the rocket ship blowing up? And it's a very complicated issue to address in terms of the angle of entry, and there's all kinds of geometry and physics and so forth, and math involved. And as a young black woman, she had a number of strikes against her. One, she was young. Two, she was a woman. Three, she was black. And put that trifecta together, she was not respected and not welcomed in that context. Not even seen as a possible contributor. And yet she ended up holding the secret, and she was gradually, through different ways, allowed into the white world, the white campus on the other side of the location where the work was being done. But she couldn't be a full participant in that. She couldn't use the restrooms that said white. And when you start to think about some of the things we were talking about before, when she had to use the facilities, something we all have to do from time to time, she had to go a mile across to the other campus where the colored restrooms were. That was the language in those days, right? So you've walked a mile before, you know how long it takes, and even if you're trying to go quickly in your high heels, which you have to wear as a woman in that context, right? Then it took her a while to get there, a while to get back. What kind of assumptions do you think they were making when she wasn't at her desk? Maybe she doesn't care, she's not as committed, and so on and so forth. Really thinking through the challenges that these women experienced. It was a story I did not know, I should have known. I did not know, and it contributes, again, to my understanding of these issues in our contemporary society. So I think there's opportunities to gain exposure. Let's go through just a few examples, All right, and then will take you through some of the evidence that supports this approach. Many of you may have seen this. This is from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We have a black man carrying a case of a 12-pack of Pepsi, and there's some food in that sack. And the caption reads, "A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a store in New Orleans, 2005." Anything noteworthy about that?
Not alleged.
I'm sorry?
It's not alleged, it's just assumed that he did it.
Yeah, it's not alleged, it's assumed that he did it, and did it means looting, yeah. And it becomes even more poignant, if you will, and noticeable when you see this one, where you have two white people also going through chest-deep water, where it says they wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. An innocent explanation for the white people's behavior, a criminal explanation for the black person's behavior. And I guess in these circumstances, what I want to encourage people to do, you said it was assumed not known. Somebody said it was assumed not known. Ask the question, how do I know? I mean, how do we know he didn't take those groceries from his own house? Right? And that these people stole. We don't know. They may have taken it from their house too, but just stopping to ask the question, how do I know, turns out to be important. The juxtaposition of these two things makes it very salient, yet we need to learn to tune into these things without the second example necessarily being present. So to illustrate this, I want to suggest that the way that black people are represented in the media, particularly with regard to violent crimes, is different than for white people. So our colleagues in communication arts do media content analyses to see how black people and white people are portrayed across a lot of different domains. And one of the things to try to, by way of illustrating this point, I want to suggest to you is that if any one of us was the victim of a violent crime in this contemporary society, it would be twice as likely to be at the hands of a white person than a black person. Part of that is just numbers. Just actual numbers of people. The second part of that is that black people are actually not more prone to violent behavior dispositionally than are white people. So you put those together and you kind of come up with that reality. And yet you've all experienced the evening news when there's been a violent crime. If the alleged assailant is black, very often the picture of the person is presented. But if the alleged assailant is white for a violent crime, you don't see a picture. Notice what's that doing? Strengthening that association between dark skin and criminal behavior, not showing the same association for white people, all right? So it's about 50% more likely that you will see that black image with the story. The words we use matter. How we characterize our own and other people's behavior matters. The assumptions that we make about whether this is sort of the lone person walking around or the resident, it matters, right? In terms of whether we're really including people in the New Orleans community and so forth, right? The more we tune into these things, the more we can regulate the extent to which we at least think about people in those ways. I'm going to show you this. We talked about media, at least a very little bit. Here's a commercial for a baby formula. I just want to present it to you. And does the sound work well?
Sound works.
Okay. It goes by very quickly, so see if you notice anything.
Since their very first days, your baby starts to write their future.
Okay, from its very first days. So the baby formula is going to be really important in charting the future. Actually, what I would argue is prescriptive norms may be setting the stage for what those futures may be. Was there anything unusual about the characterizations? Yeah.
The girl's a ballerina and the boy's a mathematician.
Yeah, so the abacus for the boy, the dancing for the girl. Now, I want to be very clear. There's nothing wrong with being a dancer. It's a perfectly acceptable laudatory profession, right? But what we're seeing in here is that the prescriptive norms are saying that's what girls do and boys do math and science, right? Now, I like science and I like math, right? And I might have liked this toy as a kid, but I never had that toy, right? And it wasn't set up as an assumption. You got to think about the messages that are being presented to the adults in culture and to kids in culture. This particular advertisement came under tremendous scrutiny in Britain, in the UK, last summer, because they were concerned about what we were telling adults is acceptable for boys and girls, and what they were really concerned about is the assumptions that little boys and little girls might have about themselves and what's possible for their futures. So let me just turn things over to Will, who will take us through some of the evidence that would give you reason to believe that if you put some effort into working on these strategies with the background that we provided, it would assist people in being less biased.
So I'm mindful of our time, so I'm going to try to go through some of this quickly. So very often, we don't always present this workshop as part of a series like your Putting Racism on the Table series that, that this is. It's very often we're brought into a company or some other sort of work environment where it's kind of like this is their diversity training or this is their bias training. And very often what we encounter is that people have had bias trainings before that they kind of weren't happy with. It kind of teaches you, oh, hey, you might have bias, but doesn't give, for instance, the strategies on how to address it. And a lot of bias trainings out there aren't evidence-based and aren't assessed over time for their effectiveness. So people kind of pull together a bias training born out of good intentions and trying to help a problem, but it's not based on scientific evidence. And that's part of where ours is different. That it's built on 30 years of Trisha's work and about 12 or 13 years of me adding to that. And so what some of the research has shown is that most bias and diversity trainings, they either aren't assessed at all, or when on occasion they are actually rigorously assessed, they either have no effect or sometimes they actually make things worse. So just speaking in a race context for a moment, they make white people nervous about displaying bias, and many of these bias trainings just don't give them tools, and so they just avoid their black coworkers because they're like, oh, I could be unintentionally biased and I don't know what to do about it. So it actually ends up very often making problems worse. So we wouldn't be here presenting this to you if we didn't have evidence over about the last 10 years showing that this kind of habit model, approaching these things like a habit, the awareness, strategies, and effort over time actually has positive effects for individuals and reducing the expression of bias. So I'm going to share just a snippet of some of that research with you. So everything I'm going to share, it's a version of what we call a randomized controlled experiment where people are randomly assigned to either go through an experience like this or to serve as a control group. So we can actually say that going through this experience causes the effects that we end up seeing. The first one I'm going to share was one of our initial tests of this with undergraduates at UW-Madison. We have to start somewhere and build from there. Basically, they get into the study, we collect some different measures from them, and then they're randomly assigned to be the control group, or they go through a computerized version of this workshop. They get to listen to me talking to them for a while, walking them through slides, showing them the Katrina news example, and so on. And we teach them a subset of the strategies that you've learned today. And then in the initial study, we followed up with them 2 weeks and 8 weeks later. And since then, we've done additional follow-ups where we've shown 2-year trajectories of some of this work. So one of the first things we wanted to assess was, well, are they thinking that discrimination, bias, et cetera, is it a serious problem? Because if they're not taking it seriously, they don't think it's a pervasive problem in society, they're not going to have that motivation to address it. It's one of the first necessary steps. And so that's what this first graph is going to show. It's a measure we call concern about discrimination. And you can see what you see here is at baseline, both the intervention and control groups, they were at the same level. They were mildly concerned about discrimination, thinking it's a problem. But as we go over the course of the study, the control group doesn't change. But the intervention group, as a function of getting this kinds of experience, they go out into the world, they start seeing these things we're talking about, seeing expressions of bias in the media and in the world around them. And they become more concerned about bias and discrimination as a serious social problem. That lasts up to 6 weeks here and then out to 2 years later in some of our other studies. Another thing that's really important is this awareness component that we spent a lot of time on at the beginning, and we also have measures of that. So this is a measure of people's awareness of their own potential to express bias. And you can see they start off at about the same level, and then over time, the people who got this intervention are more aware that they could express bias unintentionally. Now, I don't have a slide for the next part I'm going to talk about. Well, we've assessed other measures where they're also more likely to notice bias in the world around them. They're more likely to label things as bias when their friend makes some kind of joke that might be offensive. They're more likely to say, hey, that's inappropriate, and here's why. One of the follow-ups we've done, so 2 years after the intervention people have gone through an experience like this, we put them in a situation where we're trying to look at, are they willing to confront bias in a public way. So they get an email from what they think is our school newspaper called the Badger Herald. And it says, we're testing out this new thing that we're going to do where people write an editorial, and then we get some students to write responses to it, and then we'll publish this editorial with your responses. So kind of putting it out there, putting your name on it, a message that's going out. The article that they were asked to respond to was something along the lines of stereotypes are useful tools. They don't hurt anyone. They get a bad rap. Black people overreact, et cetera, saying that stereotypes are good. They create cognitive efficiency, saying that they're just a great, harmless thing. So we assessed how people disagreed with the message in that essay and whether they were willing to write a response. Everyone disagreed with the essay, even the control group who didn't get our intervention. They were like, I don't think this is right. They scored that they disagreed with it strongly on our measures. But the people who went through this intervention were more likely to write a response. And so they wrote, actually, stereotypes are harmful. Here's why. Here's some of the negative effects they have. And some of our favorite participants, 2 years after they went through our thing, they actually were like, I went through this training 2 years ago, and it said this, this, and this. And so this is very encouraging to us because it's something that they're taking and carrying with them over time and applying it in their daily lives. So these are students. Sometimes people say, well, what about real people? We always say, well, we think they are real people, but we've done it in other contexts as well. This is going to be in the gender context. So this is professors at our university. One of the big problems in STEM is underrepresentation of women. And so what we did is we developed a version of this workshop that's very focused on science and gender. And just like the other study, we randomly assigned groups to be control or intervention. What we did this at the department level. So we have 98 STEM departments. And so we randomly assigned those so that there's control and then departments that get a workshop just like this. And then we followed them over time. Because we're tight on the end, I'm going to skip forward a little. We had some similar effects. People in the departments that got our intervention were more aware of gender bias, they reported greater self-efficacy to address that bias in their departments. But they know they're in a study, so we also got some other evidence. We hooked up with an office on campus that does a general climate survey so that we could get some measures in those departments where the people don't know that it's related to the study they're a part of. Departments that had our intervention, they had much more positive climate. People in those departments reported that they were, their work was more respected, both men and women in those departments. And they were more comfortable raising family obligations, which is typically a gendered sort of thing. So had some positive effects to climate, for climate, even in a survey that they didn't know was related to the research study. But what about behavior? So one other thing we were interested in, we really cared about the underrepresentation of women in these STEM departments. So we looked at hiring data. We connected with the HR and looked at hiring data. So what we did is we looked at the percentage of new faculty hires who were men and women in the 2 years before we started our study. And what we see is about 33% women, both intervention and control departments, about the same. Then we looked the 2 years after we administered the workshops. Control departments still about 33%, but the intervention departments jumped up about 15 percentage points. So almost at the 50-50 that you would imagine if they're equally qualified men and women applying to jobs. So we really want to explore this more. We want to know the details of how this came to be. But because we have this randomized controlled study, we can't say that our intervention one way or another caused this. Now, is it that in the meetings where they're hiring people, are they committing to credentials? Or are people more likely to just raise issues of gender bias and discuss them during the process? Is it that their climates are better, as I was saying? So everyone offers jobs to women and the women only accept them at a higher rate in these departments that have more positive climate? We don't know yet, and that's one of the things we're interested in continuing to pursue, in addition to other research that we're doing on this habit-breaking approach. We're doing in schools, in medical groups, and so on, to continue understanding how these processes unfold. But one of the things we want to communicate to you about this is an individually focused sort of intervention. We're talking about these strategies you can use in your own minds, but it leads to, or can lead to, change in institutions as well, and we think that's very promising. So, a few concluding thoughts. Sorry for keeping you over a little. Unintentional bias, it's a habit that can be broken with effort. It's a process. Expect to slip up, but if you return to these strategies, return to this general approach, it can be accomplished. Stay committed. And then, as I've sort of said already, people can be agents of change that create change within institutions. And as Tricia said a couple of times, we don't think this is a silver bullet. This is not the only thing that needs to be done to fix racism, racial disparities, and other sorts of bias in society, but it is one approach that can be part of a multifaceted way of addressing these problems in society. And with that, I say thank you, and we're going to send you these slides so you'll have all the info. Thank you very much.
Thank you to United Philanthropy Forum for making the videos possible. With every video, there's a viewing guide and a discussion guide to facilitate your use of this resource. I really want to thank you for being a part of this learning series, for being a part of expanding the table for racial equity. And in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.